As I write this, my adopted home, the United States, has just celebrated its 250th anniversary. Just about everyone in the US can tell you when the country was founded, even down to the day, July 4th, 1776. Of course, there is some nuance around that date. If you wanted to be pedantic, you could probably argue for September 3rd, 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain recognised US independence. Or March 1st, 1781, when the first form of a unified US government, the Articles of Confederation, were enacted. You could also argue for September 17th, 1787, when the current US Constitution was adopted. And if you wanted to be really pedantic, you could even argue that the correct date is July 2nd, 1776, when the Continental Congress voted in favour of independence. But these nuances are well understood, not just by those with a particular specialist interest in the subject, but by many Americans with little broader interest in history. The nuances are indeed considered significant enough that they are taught within the school system. The situation in the country of my birth, in Scotland, is rather different. Your average Scottish person cannot give you a date for the founding of Scotland. I conducted a completely unscientific survey for this video, where I asked several Scottish people when they thought Scotland was founded, and got various different dates as guesses, most significantly removed from the actual traditional date given for the founding of Scotland. The most common answer I got, which I only got 2 times, so it wasn't super common, was 1745, which I'm pretty sure was a misremembering of the famous Jacobite uprising of that same year. This is partly because history is taught somewhat differently in Scotland than I think most other countries. There tends to be a focus on a few significant periods of history, rather than an overview of national or world history. And the founding of Scotland is distant enough and not considered to be culturally significant enough in modern Scotland to be included within those periods. So when was Scotland founded? Well, if you Google that question, you'll get the traditional date of 843, the date that is traditionally given for the unification of Pictland and the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriata under Kenneth MacAlpin, traditionally considered to be the first Scottish king. But the realities are more complicated than this simple date. Before 843, what is now Scotland was split into roughly 4 main regions. There were the Picts in the northeast. There were the Gaels in the west, with their kingdom of Dalriata, a kingdom that also extended into the north of Ireland. There were the Britons in the southwest, with their kingdom of Strathclyde. And finally, there were the Anglo-Saxons in the southeast, with their kingdom of Northumbria extending well down into England. You could also add a 5th region to this, one that developed after 843, but was not incorporated into Scotland until well into the medieval period, that being the territories formerly part of the Pictish, Briton and Gaelic worlds that became Scandinavian colonies during and after the 9th century, those particularly being the Western Isles, the Western Highlands, Galloway and the far north, particularly Sutherland and Caithness, as well as the Northern Isles. The coming together of these 4 or 5 regions to form something even remotely recognisable as Scotland today was a long and complicated process, and one where at least I would argue a single clear date isn't really appropriate. In my opinion, and as I will try and show in this video, the formation of Scotland was more of a process than it was a single event. In the years before 843, the Picts were split into a number of regional kingdoms, under the hegemony of the northern kingdom of Fortriu. However, in 839, the Picts suffered a devastating defeat, where at least according to the account contained within the Annals of Ulster, the Pictish king was killed, along with many of his nobles, while fighting against a group of Vikings. Alongside the king of the Picts, there is also recorded the death of a Gaelic man named Ailpín MacBawanta, who is generally thought to have been the king of Dalriata, although our understanding of the kings of Dalriata at this time is rather limited. This battle in 839 threw much of northern Scotland into chaos, and while our sources from this time are pretty limited, a power struggle seems to have ensued. Out of this struggle, the man we know as Kenneth MacAlpin came to power. Like many of the nobles of both Pictland and Dalriata, he himself was reportedly of mixed Pictish and Gaelic heritage, and had a claim to both the throne of Dalriata and to that of Pictland, although this might be at least partially the result of a later genealogy designed to promote the legitimacy of the Alpinid dynasty. While the specifics of what happened here are incredibly murky, according to the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba, he appears to have been crowned King of Dalriata, and then 2 years later, sometime in the 840s, he became King of the Picts, likely being the victor of a post-839 power struggle. 843 is the traditional date, but that is hardly beyond question. By doing this, he united Gaelic and Pictish kingship in Scotland, and formed the core of what would later be known as the Kingdom of Alba, or in English, the Kingdom of Scotland. Kenneth MacAlpin, though, doesn't seem to have called himself the King of Alba. In contemporary sources, such as the Annals of Ulster, he is recorded as Rex Pictorum, Latin for King of the Picts. It won't be for another few generations that his successors will refer to themselves as Rí Alpin, or King of Scotland. While Kenneth MacAlpin was probably the first person to join Pictish and Gaelic kingship, although it appears Dalriata might have undergone at least one period of Pictish subordination earlier in the 8th century, and Kenneth MacAlpin was probably the first recognisably Gaelic king to rule in the east of Scotland, he was part of a wider process of the merging of these two cultures. Kenneth MacAlpin's own mother was later claimed to be a Pictish princess, as was his grandmother on his father's side. Though, as said before, these claims may be the result of later attempts to legitimise the MacAlpin dynasty. That aside, it does seem pretty likely that the royal lines were already becoming quite intertwined. In addition, Gaelic culture was spreading through Pictland. Insular Christianity was spreading from Ireland, and had become the dominant faith among the Picts in the centuries before the 840s. Gaelic culture was becoming prominent in other ways too, with apparently Old Irish-influenced names appearing among the Pictish kings, and the Irish-originated Ogham writing system also making at least sporadic appearances in Pictland. Kenneth MacAlpin's own patronymic, Alpin, has also been argued to be at least possibly Pictish. If that is accurate, then it further shows just how entwined these cultures had become, even before Gaelic and Pictish kingship merged. And of course, in that battle back in 839, the Dalriatan king seems to have fought and died alongside much of the Pictish aristocracy, as they stood together against that common Viking threat. Regardless of Kenneth MacAlpin's own claims to the kingdom of Dalriata, he doesn't seem to have controlled much territory in the west of modern Scotland. As he gained power in the east, the Norse were also asserting control over the traditional lands of Dalriata in the west, and seemed to have consolidated control over much of the Isles, leaving him with a territory that looked rather similar to the former Pictish territories, although much of the north and the west of his kingdom was severely exposed to Norse raiding and settlement, leaving him with a power base most securely under his control between roughly modern-day Fife and modern-day Aberdeenshire, with a particular significance on modern Perth and Kinross. Even this area wasn't safe though, with Viking raids going deep into his power base, such as their attack in Dunkelds. At this same time, the Britons of Strathclyde attacked as well, burning Dunblane. This is all a rather chaotic start to a country, and yet despite the threats that they faced, it would be the descendants of Kenneth MacAlpin who would survive, and it would be them who would go on to unite much of Scotland into something more recognisable. So was Kenneth MacAlpin the founder of Scotland? And can we say that Scotland was founded in the 840s? Well, it's probably as good a date as any other, and Kenneth MacAlpin is probably as important a figure as any other. He clearly played an important role in the Gaelicisation of the Scottish East, and the merging of Gaelic and Pictish kingship. And yet, in his own time, he seems to have always claimed to be king of the Picts, and contemporary accounts appear to treat him more as a Pictish ruler than a Gaelic one. Over the next few decades, the descendants of Kenneth MacAlpin would continue to hold out against the Vikings. They experienced some disastrous defeats, such as at the Battle of Dollar in 875, where a Viking force defeated King Constantine, and a year later reportedly killed him in another incident in Fife. In the north too, the Norse pressed into Sutherland and Caithness and raided deep into Moray. Despite their tactical defeats, however, the realm of the Alpinid dynasty appears to have held out better than the surrounding states, and ended the 9th century intact, and even consolidated to some degree. This could not be said for the other states of northern Britain. For centuries, the Britons of Strathclyde had ruled from their seemingly impenetrable fortress on Dumbarton Rock. Yet in 870, a Viking force from Dublin took the fortress, crippling the once powerful kingdom and beginning its decline. In 865, a Norse force known as the Great Heathen Army invaded the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The first victim of this was the Kingdom of Northumbria, which came under mostly Norse control for the next century. However, the north of Northumbria, the part in modern-day Scotland, never really came under full Norse control, instead existing in a reduced form for the next few decades. These events transformed the realm of the Alpinid dynasty, from one small polity among many to one of the most powerful non-Norse forces in Britain. It is in this environment that the grandson of Kenneth MacAlpin, Domnall mac Constantine, is first called by a new Irish title, Rí Alpín, a title that we would translate into English as King of Scotland. So is this transformation from the King of the Picts to the King of Alba around the turning of the 10th century the true founding of Scotland? Maybe, but it's hard to tell how significant this was in reality. Old Irish was already becoming the dominant elite language under the previous rulers of the Alpinid line, even as they continued to style themselves as King of the Picts. The adoption of this new title doesn't seem to have signalled any particularly great transformation in the Kingdom of Alba. The kings of 10th century Alba appear to have governed and acted rather similarly to the Gaelic kings of Pictland in the second half of the 9th century. The term Alba is also interesting. It appears etymologically linked to the modern English Albion, yet its precise origins are unclear. We have a reference from the Chronicle of the Kings of Alba to a term that I'm just going to pronounce as Alapidozzi. It's Latin, it's unclear how it's meant to be pronounced. I'm not quite sure anyone else has any idea. The Alapidozzi here are presented as a separate group from the Gaelic Scoti. It is of course possible that the Alapidozzi here are simply referring to the people of the Kingdom of Alba, while the Scoti here may be some other Gaelic group, possibly from Western Scotland, somewhere not integrated into the Kingdom of Alba at this time. But it has also been proposed that Alapidozzi might be an indigenous endonym originating with the Picts, and therefore the term Alba itself, while Gaelicised, could have a Pictish origin. Now, the idea of the Picts having a single unified endonym is controversial enough anyway, and even if there was one single endonym, there are other compelling candidates, at least one, I think, probably with better evidence for it than Alapidozzi. But if Alba is of Pictish origin, then were the Alpinid line even adopting a new term? We don't know what Old Irish term the first kings in the Alpinid line were calling themselves. We only have the Latin Rex Pictorum, so of course it's entirely possible that the transition from Rex Pictorum to Rí Alpín represents a shift from writing in Latin to writing in both Latin and Middle Irish. It's possible that the early Alpinid kings, and maybe even at least some of the Picts before them, were already calling themselves kings of Alba. This is of course speculative, but the possibility does complicate our interpretation of this transition. During the 10th century, the Alpinid line extended its influence south into what are now the Scottish lowlands. In the southeast, the Rump Northumbrian kingdom came under increasing pressure from the Alpinids. While theoretically under English rule after 927, its status does not seem to have been particularly secure. Scottish influence over the Lothians and the borders likely increased gradually with a combination of conflict, raiding, pressure and diplomacy. Later sources report that in 973, a treaty between the Scottish King Kenneth II and his English counterpart Edgar granted control over a territory in the modern-day Scottish southeast to the Alpinids. But it's debated how accurate this was, and the process was likely a slower and less decisive one in reality. It is likely that the Scottish-English border would not truly stabilise until the 11th century, particularly after the Battle of Carham in the 1010s, after which the Scottish-English border began to settle into something close to what we would recognise today. At the same time, Strathclyde was transforming from an independent state dealing with some Scottish meddling to a vassal state of Scotland, from where it was slowly integrated. The specifics of how this happened are unfortunately largely lost to us. In the early 12th century, the future King David I of Scotland would be recorded as Princeps Cumbriensis, possibly the last reference to some sort of successor entity to Strathclyde within the Kingdom of Scotland. In Galloway and in Sutherland, Scottish kings of the 11th century also gained greater control over areas of Norse settlement. By the end of the 11th century, they exerted control over most of modern-day Scotland, and a little of what is now the north of England, minus the western and northern isles that were still under Norse control. Although we should be careful not to think of this as a simple expulsion of the Scandinavians, as many of the territories settled by the Norse retained Norse rulers and significant autonomy, despite their integration into the Scottish political system. And indeed there had been significant melding between the Gaelic and the Norse cultures within modern-day Scotland. By the 11th century, there probably wasn't a clear line between who was Scottish and who was Norse. Also in the 11th century, the kings of Alba began adopting a new Latin title, Rex Scotorum, directly translated as King of the Scots. In the following centuries, it would be Scotland, rather than Alba, that would come to be the default name of the country. Despite the increasing use of the term Scotland, though, Scottish kings would continue to be referred to as Kings of Alba in the Gaelic-speaking regions all the way through the Stuart period, and Alba remains the Scottish Gaelic term for Scotland to this day. After the Norwegian-Scottish War in 1266, the Western Isles were incorporated into Scotland, while in 1472 Scotland officially took control over Orkney and Shetland, having previously held on to them as security for a Norwegian debt that was never paid since 1468. And with this, Scotland gained roughly the borders that it has today. But the country is not just its borders. Scotland transformed from a decentralised, personal kingship, heavily based on those personal and kindred bonds, to one that increasingly came to resemble the other states of feudal Europe. By the reign of David I in the 12th century, increasing numbers of Norman nobles were being invited to settle in the Scottish lowlands, bringing with them new continental practices, and this was encouraged by the new Dunkeld dynasty. Under the Dunkelds, Scotland transformed into a kingdom with political and legal institutions much more reminiscent of other parts of Europe. This included things like the establishment of the burgh system and the introduction of the first Scottish coinage. The Middle Irish language that would develop into the modern Scottish Gaelic also began to lose importance in the 12th century, especially within the Scottish court, the new burghs, and the newly settled Anglo-Norman aristocrats, who held significant influence, especially in the lowlands. This coincided with a rise in the importance of English. This was due to increasing influence from the Kingdom of England, as well as the rising importance of the southeast of Scotland, a region that had spoken English since before its integration into the kingdom. The result of this was the rise of what we would now call the Scots language, although at the time it was simply referred to as English. While Gaelic, of course, still exists in Scotland, and even to this day retains significant cultural importance across the country, by the late Middle Ages, Scotland was very much politically dominated by the Scots language and the culture associated with it, especially in the increasingly important urban centres of the south. While Gaelic culture and language, despite its importance to the founding of Scotland, had become increasingly marginalised within the country's institutions of power. So when then can we say Scotland was founded? With the ascension of Kenneth MacAlpin to the throne sometime around 843? With the first recorded use of the term Alba to refer to Scotland as something distinct from Pictland, sometime around the year 900? When Scotland finished its long process of incorporating the Britons of Strathclyde and the Angles of the Lothians and Borders by around the middle of the 11th century? Or when Scotland began to establish itself as a then modern medieval state in the 11th and the 12th centuries? Do we draw a line between the Gaelic Scotland of the Alpinids, the transitional Dunkelds, and the increasingly Scots-speaking Scotland of the Stuarts? Exactly when Scotland was founded is a difficult question, and one where at least I think the simple date of 843 fails to capture the wider nuance. Exactly what answer you want to go with is up to you. It's ultimately a subjective matter. But in truth, I think the best way of describing it is that Scotland as an entity developed over a period of time, from about the mid-9th century to the late 11th century, as it transformed from a divided land ravaged by Viking raids to something more resembling the Scotland we know today. But those are my thoughts. When do you think Scotland was founded? Give me your ideas, your comments, and your corrections below, and thank you for watching.